Welcome everyone to our Mapping Social Cohesion 2024 report webinar. I'm Anthea Hancock, the CEO of the Scanlon Foundation Research Institute, or Scanlon Institute as a shorthand. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands from which we're coming from today and pay my respects to the elders past and present and to any guests of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander heritage here with us today. Please feel free to recognise the lands you are on by acknowledging them using the chat function. This year, we're holding this event some days after the official in-person launch in Melbourne. The intention is to allow much more time for questions, so we're presuming that many of you will have already seen the report, read the executive summary, or even viewed the launch presentation on our YouTube site. But just in case you haven't, I'm delighted that we have both Dr. James O'Donnell and Trish Prentice with us today to recap some of the findings in the report and perhaps stimulate a few more questions or queries that you may have. So shortly, I will invite Dr. O'Donnell and Trish Prentice to spend about 20 minutes revisiting some of the findings, and then we will take questions from you. I invite you to lodge those questions using the chat function when it opens near the end of your presentations. I then look forward to fielding those questions, and between the three of us, we hope to be able to answer as many as possible. For those who have not yet accessed the report, you can find it on our website at scanloninstitute.org.au. You can also find the microsite, the stakeholder pack in languages, and the introductory video. But it's also important to note that the report is more than 110 pages long and rich with data and analysis, and that it is impossible for a 20-minute presentation to cover. There is considerable analysis across many of the demographic variables that you may find of interest, as well as explanatory appendices regarding the methodology. On that note, I'd like to invite James O'Donnell, and the lead author of the Mapping Social Cohesion Report for 2024, and Trish Prentice, the Scanlon Institute senior researcher and the author of the qualitative chapter on polarisation, to join and provide an overview to the findings. Over to you, James and Trish.
Thanks, Anthea. So I'll go first and talk about some of the survey findings, and then we'll throw over to Trish to talk through some of the qualitative findings. Now, this work is collaborative work between the Australian National University, of which I'm a part, and the Scanlon Foundation Research Institute, where Anthea and Trish work. We also have another author, Dr. Ching Guan, who couldn't be with us today. She gave birth to a beautiful baby girl. And so as much as she'd like to be here, obviously has some more pressing concerns at the moment. Now, Anthea, you can see my slides okay?
I absolutely can.
Thanks, Anthea. So this year's study, a quantitative and qualitative study combining both the surveys and the qualitative interviews. As every year, we started the survey in July. We had more than 100 questions related to social cohesion and related attitudes, perceptions, and behaviours. In 2024, we had more than 8,000 people complete a survey. Most of those complete the survey in July through the Social Research Centre's Life in Australia panel. Now, the Life in Australia panel allows people to complete the survey online or telephone, but such as the modern way, most people these days do it by do the survey online, but still some people are given the opportunity to do it by telephone to ensure that we're able to cross any digital barriers. And we also had a shorter online survey that people completed through July, August, and September, with 229 adults from different cultural groups to make sure we continue to represent all of Australia's diversity as best as we can. And those people were allowed to complete the survey in one of 4 different languages, including English. And then for Trish's component, she interviewed 45 people with a broad cross-section of Australians to look at the impacts of polarisation on Australia's social cohesion. The way we measure social cohesion has done since 2007 is through these 5 domains. So 5 key domains of social cohesion: the sense of belonging, so the sense of pride and belonging that we feel in Australia and our communities, and pride in the Australian way of life. A sense of worth refers to a sense of happiness and personal well-being, and includes also financial satisfaction. The social inclusion and justice domain, referring to the sense of justice in society and trust in government. Participation around engagement in social community, civic groups and political activities. and acceptance and rejection, acceptance and support for differences and diversity, and experience of discrimination. And we've got more discussion on each of these domains in the report and in the recording from last week's launch. Before we take questions in each of the 5 domains, a selection of questions each of the 5 domains, to come up with an overall scale and index of social cohesion to help us track at a higher level how social cohesion is tracking in society. And this is what it looks like since the first survey was conducted in 2007. Scores are benchmarked to that first survey in 2007. So where we set the scores for social cohesion to 100 in 2007, and then everything is measured in relation to that first survey. So a score of 90, for example, is 10 points below its 2007 levels. Now, prior to 2018, the survey was conducted just as a telephone survey. Then we transitioned to Life in Australia in 2018, and it became mostly an online survey. And that changed some of the responses. So when people didn't have to speak to someone over the phone, more likely to say that they were experiencing financial difficulties, more likely to say that they were unhappy, a lower sense of belonging, just when they didn't have to admit that, I guess, to someone, a real person over the phone. But we can adjust and correct for that effect. And when we do that, we can get a sort of a consistent measure of how our cohesion, again, at a high level, has been tracking over time. And so across the 2010s, it's quite stable, averaging around a score of 91, picked up during the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, when we responded positively to sort of government efforts to protect our health and well-being, as well as to a sort of a galvanizing effect within our community. So we're more connected with our neighbours and local communities. It's come down a little bit since then, although given the challenges we face in the world today, and we'll talk about some of those during the survey, so there's a credit that social cohesion has actually been on this measure been stable over the last 12 months. So in 2023, we got to a score of 85 and 85 again in 2025. So we might have expected that social cohesion has been under a lot of pressure over the last 12 months with national and global pressures. There is perhaps a sense of resilience there, though social cohesion is still below its longer term trend. So what we're suggesting, what's emerging from these findings, is that social cohesion in Australia today is a story of strengths and challenges, where we have some traditional strengths that have been under pressure and declining over a reasonable period of time, but some resilient and continued strengths, but then some continued challenges and some new pressures on important strengths. So for example, on those traditional strengths, we've historically had a high sense of belonging and sense of fairness and the fair go in Australia. That's been under pressure, though, for several years and been declining. Financial well-being is under pressure in more recent years through cost of living pressures, and probably feeding into all of that, we're a little bit less optimistic and more pessimistic about the future, both in our own lives and pessimism towards the future of Australia. We're reasonably happy, though. Happiness has been resilient and personal well-being has been resilient through recent years. And we continue to be engaged in our communities as well. Have continuing challenges in terms of the experience of discrimination and declining trust in government, and then some new pressures. So two emerging strengths in recent years has been a support for multiculturalism and the multicultural relations, which has been strong and strengthened during the pandemic, as did our sort of neighbourhood connections and the sense to which we get along well and support our neighbours. Those are still really important assets, but we can see some pressures on those in the context of some of the national and global challenges we face. So we'll talk some more about those quickly. As I say, have a look at the report and if you get the opportunity, the recording from the launch last week to give you a full picture, but I'll just give you now an overview of some of the highlights. So on migration, well, it's a really divisive issue in the world today, particularly across Europe and the United States, particularly with some recent elections, most notably in the United States. In Australia, we've done reasonably well, and attitudes to migrants and multiculturalism remain largely positive, but we do see a few signs of some pressure points. One of the biggest changes we've detected over the last couple of years has been the proportion of people who think that immigration is too high. So the proportion who think it's been too high has increased from 24% in 2022 to 49% in 2024 this year. We've had corresponding declines in the proportion who say immigration is too low or about right. As we explain in the report, that we've got to put this in proper context, and noting that we were emerging from COVID-19 border closures. We did have an actual spike in immigration after those opening of borders, and immigration has been at historically high levels. And we show in the report how the proportion of people that think immigration is too high is closely followed the proportion of the actual immigration levels. And then we have some at federal government level, both the federal government and opposition disagreeing a lot over what to do, but both saying that essentially immigration is too high, and we're expecting that that's helping to lead community attitudes towards this. At the same time, we see the importance of the economy too in several results. Economic growth per person has been declining, and people in our survey are showing that they are concerned about the economy and housing. So even amongst those who think that immigration is too high, only about 7% of them say that immigration itself is the #1 issue facing Australia. 2/3 are actually saying it's the economy and housing that's the #1 problem. So people are relating their attitudes on the size of migration to economic issues. And encouragingly, that support for our diversity and multiculturalism has still remained reasonably high. So still 85% of us think that multiculturalism has been good for Australia. 92% think that migrants born outside Australia are just as likely to be good citizens as someone born in Australia. 82% continue to believe that migrants improve Australian society by bringing new ideas and cultures, and think that migrants generally are good for the economy. On some measures, these have declined a little bit. So, for example, in the last 12 months, the proportion that agree that accepting immigrants from many different countries makes Australia stronger has declined by a few points. We suspect that's tied in quite a bit with attitudes towards the size of migration program. And so people, so far at least, have been able to distinguish their views on the number of migrants coming in to Australia from the composition of migrants and the value and benefit of multiculturalism and our diversity. It's reflected to an extent in our intercultural relations. So it's one thing to have a high symbolic support for immigration and multiculturalism. It's a whole other thing to have lived behaviours within our communities, across communities and intercultural relations. And so we had some strengths and some challenges here, where most people enjoy learning about different customs and heritage. They want to learn more. They like meeting and getting to know people from different backgrounds, and often do. So 59% there on the left often say they often spend time with people from different backgrounds, and 80% say they have 2 or more close friends from different backgrounds. At the same time, there, discrimination is a persistent concern. So around 1 in 3 people from non-English speaking backgrounds, you can see this on the right, experienced discrimination in the last 12 months based on skin color, ethnic origin, or religion. And there's some other experiences here that we're picking up in the survey, where people from non-English speaking backgrounds are also telling us they can be treated unfairly in the workplace, generally made to feel like they don't belong, and treated differently or less favorably in a variety of ways. Around about 59% of people from non-English speaking backgrounds believe racism in Australia is a very or fairly big problem, although interestingly, that's not necessarily any higher than the proportion of Australian-born people who think racism is a problem in Australia. Now, looming over some of those intercultural relations in the last 12 months is the conflict in Gaza and spreading to the wider Middle East. And we can see some pressures on our intercultural relations in the survey. And so for several years now, we've measured the proportion of people who have a positive, neutral, or negative attitudes towards different religious groups. So we did see an increase in the proportion of people who have a negative attitude towards Muslims over the last 12 months, from 27% to 34%. That had at least been declining over time, but it's still a substantial minority of people, 34%. The proportion of people who have a negative attitude towards Jewish people increased over the same period from 9% to 13%. Though those sort of negative attitudes are not necessarily any more common than attitudes to other faith groups generally. And then on the flip side, the proportion of people with positive attitudes has also declined, but declined across all groups. And so not necessarily something that's specific to Muslim or Jewish communities. So that's not, of course, not to detract or downplay the difficult experiences that many within our Muslim and Jewish communities have been experiencing over the last 12 months. But at a general level, and these are really representing sort of general attitudes at a national level, we can see that, you know, we can pick up some of those difficulties that might be experienced in those communities, but there are probably larger questions as well around some of our intercultural and interfaith relations. Just quickly, we look at how some of these attitudes vary by political orientation, and look at whether, you know, things like social media might be impacting people's attitudes, whether people are getting caught into echo chambers that then exacerbate sort of negative attitudes, you know, towards people of Muslim and Jewish faith. Interestingly, though, we find that regular social media users, those that are using social media daily, are actually less likely to have negative attitudes towards Muslim or Jewish people. So here, for example, you know, people who describe themselves as left-wing or progressive, 23% of them who use social media daily have a negative attitude towards Muslim people, compared to 37% of left-wing people who don't use social media very regularly. You know, we see a similar difference for people on the right wing, and also in respect to Jewish people. So we're by no means suggesting that social media is not, you know, that does not have misinformation, but just that most people are able to distinguish some of the information that they might be seeing that coming through social media from their attitudes towards people. So that was an encouraging result. Another big issue has been, of course, over the last couple of years, has been the economy and cost of living pressures, and also particularly at a national level, some issues around personal safety and well-being. And we're seeing some of this reflected in the survey too. So, for example, the first question on the survey asked people what do they think is the most important problem facing Australia today, and almost 50% of them in 2024, like they did in 2023, said the economy is the #1 issue facing Australia, and another 15% or so said housing shortages and affordability. And these are at quite historically high levels. We measure financial stress along different indicators, and we find similar results to what we did last year. So that there's some of the financial pressures haven't really budged over the last 12 months. So 40% saying they're dissatisfied, 41% saying they're, you know, at best just getting along financially. And then, you know, at varying levels, people are having to sacrifice on meals and the rent or mortgage and medicines and healthcare due to a shortage of money. Again, mostly at similar levels to what they were reporting last year. Financial stress was particularly common among renters. So, for example, 61% of renters said they were just getting along at best. And almost 50%, 48% said they couldn't pay for medicines, healthcare, meals, and or their rent, sometimes or often in the last 12 months due to a lack of money. On that point about safety, for both men and women, we're detecting an increase in the proportion of feeling a little bit unsafe in their local communities. So, for example, the proportion of women who said they were at least fairly worried about becoming a victim of crime in their local area, this increased from 25% in 2021 to 36% in 2024. Similar increase, but from a lower base for men as well. And both financial stress, safety, and social cohesion are important to, well, financial stress and safety are important to our social cohesion and strongly related. And so when we compare people who are financially prosperous to those who are struggling a little bit, we see that those who are struggling are much less likely to say they've been happy, to have a great sense of belonging, to trust in the government, and to believe in this sort of sense of fairness and the fair go in Australia, and also less accepting of our diversity and multiculturalism. And that's similar also for people who are feeling unsafe in their communities. It's difficult to say exactly the extent to which financial stress or perceived unsafety, you know, directly causes a reduction in social cohesion, but we can say, after controlling for all sorts of different characteristics of people, that those who are feeling unsafe and or feeling financially stressed are much less likely to say they have strong connections within their communities. So we'll now throw over to Trish to take us through some of the findings of the qualitative survey. Trish, are you able to control the slides now?
Yep, that should be fine. Thank you. Thanks, James. So recently we've decided to add a qualitative component to our Mapping Social Cohesion study. And the reason for that is Unlike survey data, we can gather different insights through interviews with people, and people can tell us things like why they believe a certain thing or why they think the way that they think. So this year's study, we decided to choose polarisation as our topic. Now, polarisation, I'm sure, is a word that you've heard mentioned a lot recently. Anyone with any exposure at all to the American election would have heard terms like, or phrases like, America is deeply polarised. There's polarisation between the left and the right, or voters are polarised around particular issues. And now we're starting to hear this terminology mentioned in Australia as well. I'm just checking my slides. There might be a delay with the transition. Do you want to change it for me, James, if you can?
Sure.
Thanks. So if you have a look at the graph on the right-hand side here, there was a report released in 2023 by the Edelman Trust Barometer group. And one of their major findings was that Australia is moderately polarised. So if you have a look on the right-hand side, those countries deeply in the red are thought to be severely polarised. And Australia is sitting in that middle band there in the kind of dark orange section. But polarisation is actually quite a tricky thing to measure. If we understand polarisation to be division, it's quite a relative term. We might argue that some sense of division or difference of opinion is really important in a democracy, in a place like Australia. We don't want everyone thinking the same. But at what point do we start to believe that difference of opinion becomes something negative and detrimental to society? I think that's a really important question. There are also different ways of measuring polarisation. So as James showed us before, he'd done some mapping out of distinctions in attitudes and beliefs. This is ideological polarisation. We can measure differences of opinion and the extent of those differences. We can also measure affective polarisation, which is the extent to which people feel negative emotions or dislike towards those who think differently to them. And we could also measure perceptions of polarisation, which is something quite different again, and not actually polarisation itself. It's just people's impressions. Sorry, I haven't got control of the slides. You'll have to change it for me, James. Thanks. So some of the issues we were interested in exploring are up on the screen now. I won't read them all for you, but we were certainly interested in seeing whether people had this perception that Australia was polarised, and if so, on what issues was there divergence? And could we see any differences in the perceptions of older Australians versus younger Australians? We thought that was quite interesting to explore as well. And so these are some of our findings. Sorry, next slide. And again. So one of the first questions I asked people was, do you think Australia is more united or more divided than it used to be in the past? And the majority of people I interviewed said Australia is more divided than it used to be. Now, when I broke down this finding into age groups, it was definitely a stronger sentiment amongst older Australians. So those in the 55 age group and above felt that Australia was definitely more divided. Some of the young people did as well, but there was definitely less of a strong sense of division. And there were many who felt that Australia was not more divided or more united. It's just there were more voices in the public sphere. It was just louder because people have more ways to communicate their opinions, unlike before. Sorry, next slide. So my next question naturally was, on what issues was there perceived division? The most frequently mentioned response, which is consistent with our survey data, was immigration, followed by the war on Gaza, the voice to Parliament or First Nations people's rights, the cost of living, and climate change. So these are the major issues where people perceive there to be division at the moment. Yep, next slide. The next group of questions I asked were to get a sense of how people felt public and private debate was occurring in Australia. So I asked people, are people more or less willing to engage with those who hold different opinions now compared to the past? Have you ever changed your own views after talking to someone about an issue? And are there any issues that you avoid discussing in your own social circles? So this is to get a sense of what private conversations are like as well. And this is what we found. So there were three major trends that I want to point out, which I think are important to note from the responses to these questions. And the first one is what I would describe as entrenchment. Now, entrenchment is this notion that people are stuck on their point of view. They don't have the ability to move forward, or they're unwilling to listen to new arguments or new information. So I'll give you a moment just to have a read of this quote on the screen. And you can kind of get a sense of what I'm talking about. More steadfast, less open-minded. So this inability to change in public discussion. The next trend that was observed in these responses was what I've called partisan animosity. And what this refers to is this sense that it's not only that I disagree with you as a person, but I actually don't like you as a person as well. So this dislike or hostility or animosity towards those who think differently. And again, have a read of the quote on the screen. You can get a sense of what I mean, even though it doesn't kind of convey tone of voice. So you can kind of get a sense here, this is an older interviewee and talking about their perceptions of young people's contributions in public debate. And the third trend, which we noticed in the responses to those questions, was self-censorship. So unlike the first two trends, self-censorship is occurring in the private sphere. And what I mean by the private sphere is in people's conversations amongst their friends and families and workmates. Some people we interviewed are actually avoiding issues of conversation. This person here mentions that they're avoiding anything that's perceived as controversial at all. They feel they can talk about factual issues, but anything where there's a difference of opinion, they're not actually going to engage in that conversation. And on the next screen, these are some of the most frequently mentioned issues people are avoiding. So it'll flick through the responses. Gender issues, the war in Gaza, religion, politics, and climate change. So they're the main issues people are, and sexuality that they're avoiding. Next slide, thanks. So even though there were those trends, there were also some positive findings to come out of the interviews. First is that people acknowledge that in Australia we have the right to freedom of expression. Now, this was acknowledged not only as a matter of law, so as we all know, we have the right to freedom of expression, but people feel that in reality, in their day-to-day lives, there is that freedom and it's being applied in reality. The other finding was that there's still a strong commitment to public debate. So when I asked people, are they interested in debating and discussion, do they think that's important for our country? There was a majority consensus that that's the case. People really believe that public debate is important for progressing of society in general and for tackling some of these really important and critical issues that Australia is facing at the moment. So those are the positive findings. Also, the interviewees were able to identify those individuals who they thought were having a positive role in society in terms of contributing to social unity. And these groups and institutions most frequently mentioned were teachers, followed by community groups and charities, and religious groups. So that's just really an overview, a very quick snapshot of the findings. And I guess I'll conclude by saying, with qualitative research, we can't make absolute findings. We can't say on the basis of this study, we can determine that Australia is polarised. But what we can say is that through talking to people about their perceptions and observations and experiences, we can start to get a sense of what the dynamics are like in individuals' daily lives. And we've picked up some trends here, which I think are important to take note of. And potentially, if we can verify them in a larger study, they do have important consequences for the way that we conduct discussion and debate in Australia going forwards. Thanks.
Thank you, Trish. Really fascinating and interesting insight into what is a major issue in the world today, but with lots of nuance too. So really recommend people to have a look at that polarization chapter in the Mapping Social Cohesion Report, and really some fascinating insights on what, as I say, what is an important issue today. Now we want to wrap up quickly so we can get to some Q&A. But just want to finish on a slightly positive note, recognizing that, of course, we have these big national and global challenges at the moment. So, but yet our social cohesion, at least as we measure it, has been reasonably stable over the 12 months. And so what's some of the things behind that? And well, Australians on the whole remain connected and engaged within their communities. And that's been a strong positive of this year's results. And so, for example, particularly on that neighbourhood level, that's been a strength for a long time, where more than 80% of people agree that the neighbours are willing to help one and each other, and that they get along well together from different national and ethnic backgrounds as well. We're also reasonably engaged on a lived level as well. So sort of volunteering and participation in different groups has been reasonably resilient in recent years. So in 2024, 57% of us say we're involved in community support groups, things like volunteering for Vinnies and Rotary and Lions and Red Cross, involved in social or religious groups and including things like sports clubs and religious groups and multicultural clubs, or involved in civic or political groups, so things like trade unions and political parties. And so this kind of involvement is really sort of the glue that holds together many of our communities, and not so easily broken by some of the strains emerging from elsewhere. And we're reasonably happy, as I mentioned at the top. So almost 80% of us say we're happy or very happy. We have been happy or very happy over the last 12 months, and that's been reasonably consistent in recent years. We had a bit of a shift downwards in the proportion who say they're very happy when we switched from the telephone survey to an online survey. But when we removed that effect, levels of happiness have been reasonably resilient for sort of 8 to 10 years. And social cohesion is likely an important part of that in helping to protect some of our personal well-being, especially through difficult times. So one of the pieces of analysis we do in the report is to look at people who are struggling to pay their bills, look at their personal well-being, and we see that people who are struggling financially are much less likely to have a strong sense of belonging, and their personal well-being is quite a bit lower when they are struggling. But if they also believe that they have good neighbours, if they believe that their neighbourhoods are reasonably cohesive, they're much more likely to say they're happy, even if they have been experiencing financial stress. So, for example, overall, 40% of people who are struggling to pay bills say that they've been happy over the last 12 months. But if they're struggling but live in neighbourhoods that they think are places where neighbours get along well with each other, that they support each other, they help each other, they have a sense of identity and belonging within their neighbourhoods, well, the proportion of them that say they're happy doubles to almost 80%. And so, which sort of culminates in the point that I want to sort of finish on, is that national and global challenges, they put pressure on social cohesion, and we can see that in the survey. But they also demonstrate the importance of social cohesion when it's most needed. So in a world of conflict and division and economic struggle, we are on the survey saying that we're more divided on immigration, feeling a little bit less safe in our communities. We continue to face financial pressures and a little bit less positively towards people of different faiths. And yet those neighbourhood and intercultural connections remain high. Happiness, participation, and overall social cohesion have been pretty resilient. And so social cohesion is plausibly helping us to prevent deeper divisions while also supporting personal well-being and social connections. There are, of course, some difficult experiences being felt among people and communities over the last 12 months that we can't deny, but how we respond is itself an important marker of our social cohesion. So that's it for me from my prepared presentation, but just to note that this study has lots of contributors, really important people that have been helped to produce this report. But otherwise, I thank you and look forward to some interesting questions.
Well, thank you, James, and thank you, Trish, very much. And I'm going to try and keep up with the ones that are coming in. But right now, there's actually two that relate to each other. The first is about the polarization side, Trish, where there was, you had mentioned the cost of living was one of the things where people thought there was some polarization. And people are interested to know what exactly was it about cost of living that was perceived as being particularly divisive. And at the same time, James, there's also a question that relates to whether or not an increase in those essential limited resources, housing, finance, etc., if those things became more available, what would be the effect on social cohesion? So Trish, maybe over to you first.
That's a great question. So that response came in relation to the question, do you think Australia is more divided or more united than it used to be? And then on what issues? And it was a predominant response amongst young people. So they felt that it was, one of the issues where there was the greatest division. Interestingly, some people felt it was an issue on which there was the greatest unity as well. So it wasn't that they were denying that the cost of living was an issue. It was just saying, like, actually, we all realise that it is, and there's no difference of opinion there. But the majority group felt there was. They didn't actually elaborate, so I don't know the answer to that. But they certainly, when I spoke to young people in the interviews in a greater context, there was discussion about housing, there was discussion about the cost of education as well. And there was discussion about inflation in relation to food and basically daily living. So they didn't express that in the context of that question, but in the broader context of their discussion, those were the issues that they mentioned were of greatest concern to them.
Great, thanks very much, Trish. James, what about if suddenly all these limited resources became available, what effect would that have on social cohesion?
It's a great question, and to be honest, it's a question I've been thinking a lot about, but would like to have better answers on. I was hoping that with inflation moderating over the last 12 months, that we might have seen an improvement in financial satisfaction. We might be able to measure what then is the flow and effect for social cohesion, but we haven't seen that in amongst, although inflation declining in economy is still pretty slow, and people's wages still not necessarily catching up to those higher prices. So I don't know the full answer. It is something that I'm working on. It is difficult to work out, what is the cause and effect of these things, because, there could be, we can measure the associations between these things. So how much, people are feeling financially distressed, how that relates to people's sense of connection and belonging relative to how they're doing financially, and measure that over time. But, it could be all sorts of different factors, but we suspect that, we control for as many things we can, and that relationship between financial pressures and social cohesion is still really strong, and one of the strongest explanatory factors of some of these indicators that we can see in the survey. But we've got more longitudinal data now, and we'll hopefully be able to have more answers to these questions over the coming year.
Absolutely. So James, there's a question regarding those people that are experiencing less happiness, well-being or belonging. Do we have a sense of what their particular characteristics / identity are aside from financial stress? So do we have some idea?
Yeah, absolutely. So, well, there's lots of different stories we can tell and do it a little bit of in the report. We talked a bit about, sort of renters, for example, experiencing that financial stress, and then that also flows through to, some of these cohesion indicators. Young people generally have a lower sense of belonging, particularly in Australia and nationally, and some of that we might just relate to sort of shifting cultural norms and how people relate to themselves in Australia versus, sort of a global identity or a more local identity. But we can still see that younger people are also more likely to say that the, kind of things like they're socially isolated, for example, in their own personal lives. Young people are also much more, not much more, but higher levels of acceptance of differences of diversity, though. Single parent families is one that, sort of, again, the sort of the financial pressures seem to sort of weigh on their sense of connection and belonging, and so we see people in single parent families also with lower cohesion. So there's lots. We could go on forever, but I should stop.
Thanks, James. There is a question about local government area level data, which I think, but also there's another question also about regional versus metropolitan differences. I wondered if you could talk whether or not you saw any regional or rural differences to metropolitan areas, and also what the modelling process is that we use, which is then replicated in the social cohesion compass that people can find on our website as well.
Yeah, so I'd encourage people to look up the social cohesion compass and have a look, and you can explore some of the data across local government areas in Australia. I think generally speaking, it shows a pretty diverse picture, right? So regional Australia is sort of big and diverse place with lots of differences, lots of areas of sort of growing and expanding, and others not so. So you know, it'd be difficult to come up with a single picture for regional Australia. If I was to, it would be that on average that, you know, sort of regional communities are, you know, feel even, you know, quite strong bonds within their local communities. So those neighbourhood and community indicators are very strong in regional Australia, as we might hypothesise. You know, and encouragingly, you know, that sort of support for diversity and multiculturalism has also been quite strong. So I think more than 80% of people in regional Australia, you know, believe that multiculturalism has been good for Australia. You know, still that strong sense of national belonging as well, sort of a little bit stronger than the cities, but probably experiencing similar sort of downward trend. And same for some of those sort of that sense of fairness and fair go in society as well, and a little bit less trust in government than people in big cities.
James, there is a perennial question, which is whether or not the term intercultural is preferable to multicultural. And if we were to start talking more intercultural than multicultural, would that strengthen social cohesion? Trish or James, I'd be interested in both of your views on that.
I for one tend to sort of mix them up. Maybe I should distinguish between them a bit more. But you know, I think about, you know, and you would have heard me speak about sort of that symbolic support for multiculturalism at a national level, and then beneath that, then I talk about intercultural relations and how people, you know, sort of live multiculturalism in their daily lives and how connected they are with people from different groups. So not just that we're a part of society where we have, you know, sort of lots of different groups, but we're also connecting and talking to one another, that we're making friends, that we're you know, that we embrace and celebrate and connected with people, not just that we live amongst other people. So, you know, I tend to kind of talk about them
interchangeably. So, Trish, you've written on the use of language and how important it is. Do you have a particular view about this terminology and how it works together?
No, I don't actually. Like James, I tend to use them synonymously as well. I guess, yeah, contextually there might be an advantage to using one over the other, but I like James, just interchange.
Great, thanks very much. I know there's another question about did we look at type of neighbourhoods, and we did actually look about people's home ownership, but we haven't necessarily looked at whether or not the regions or the locations are high density living versus standalone homes, that sort of thing, have we, James?
No, not in this report, but that's the sort of thing that kind of plays close to my research interests, and sort of done a bit of research on that, and about how, you know, the sort of the urban and demographic and population dynamics of cities and towns help to shape our social cohesion, and, you know, how you know, a sense of, you know, how, as you'd expect, you know, I guess the more stable that the communities are, the more they've had the opportunity to sort of build the sort of social connections and roots within the community that are quite deep. And I guess then pointing towards the important policy challenge of how do we do that likewise with some sort of new and emerging and growing and more diverse communities as well. So it's a really fascinating but ongoing research project.
Yeah. There's a question here. The report highlights that only 34% of respondents take pride in the Australian way of life and culture. Based on the findings of the report, would not this result highlight a deeper decline of trust, community, and shared national vision for the future? Thoughts? So, both of you or either of you?
I think there was, you know, I mean, I mean, I think in showing some of the data, right, I think there's lots of interpretations that can be made and should be made and should open up room for that sort of discussion. In kind of facilitating that discussion, you know, some of the points that I would have that sort of emerged from the data is that perhaps there is a concern there about, you know, particularly has that sort of sense of belonging, the sense of fairness, sort of on that general decline, combined with that sort of general distrust in government, sort of coalescing around a sort of sense of potentially, you know, a sense of disconnection and you know, a little bit more doubt about, you know, sort of Australia as, you know, a land of the fair go, for example. But that's you know, questions for open debate. There's lots of things that go into that, particularly in something like belonging, as I touched on in the presentation was talking about, or actually in one of the previous answers, you know, particularly about how young people are relating to their country and the world and that sort of stuff. So there's lots of sort of things to unpick in that, but some genuine areas for discussion and sort of policy development and community response.
Yeah, there is absolutely a lot of interest in people understanding things better at the local government level. And so I would encourage people to keep an eye out for the Social Cohesion Compass, because we will be putting the 2024 data into that, and you'd be able to search on any local government area. There is quite a lot of questions coming through, so I'm probably going to not necessarily get to all of them, but I'll keep our fingers crossed. So if we can keep our answers reasonably quick, that'd be great. Is there more detail about the composition of the neighbourhoods where people say they feel a great sense of community? The question here is, are they diverse? Are they homogenous? Are they well off? So any sort of sense of how we might be able to describe the neighbourhoods that have high social cohesion, for instance?
Yeah, that's a great question, important question. And again, sort of an ongoing sort of research on that area. I mean, I guess what's emerging is this peculiar strength in Australian neighbourhoods where, you know, if you look at some of the research that's happened elsewhere in the world, you'd see that, you know, there's a very strong social gradient. So economically disadvantaged neighbourhoods are much less connected, and diverse communities as well with high migrant shares generally, you know, elsewhere, at least in the world, don't have that sort of same sense of neighbourhood cohesion. There's more homogenous neighbourhoods. That doesn't seem to hold particularly well from the Australian research, both my own research and some others from around Australia have conducted. But there is certainly that sort of social gradient to an extent where, you know, people experiencing economic disadvantage and living in more disadvantaged neighbourhoods don't have the same kind of strength of neighbourhood social cohesion. And I guess also ones that kind of experience quite a bit of turnover, you know, populations coming in and out, and where people just haven't had the time to develop those neighbourhood connections and bonds.
There is a particularly sort of future-focused question here, which is how can we counter the predominant focus on multiculturalism and migration as a determinant of social cohesion, when your studies clearly show there are other determinants? What needs to be done to improve social cohesion in Australia?
Well, my answer has always been to put the information out there, and that's what part of the role that I inherited from now Emeritus Professor Andrew Marcus, and something that's been a major focus of mine is to show that, you know, multiculturalism is important to our social cohesion, because that's the well, at least diversity is the reality of modern day Australia, and so we should be thinking about, you know, how we create a cohesive society in the context of, you know, the reality of a diverse Australia. But as our results show, it's, you know, the bigger things, not bigger things, but it's not necessarily multiculturalism or diversity itself that's detrimental to social cohesion by any stretch of the imagination. And there are some other important things that you know are important to tackle.
So James, this sort of relates to this question, which is how do we answer the skepticism of the purpose, concept, and measurement of social cohesion, which I must admit is an interesting one, and possibly related to how easily it's being thrown around at the moment, as a sense of, if we had this, everything else would be solved. But also there is a further question, what steps can be taken to achieve a truly integrated and socially cohesive Australia? So uniting what they refer to as mainstream, multicultural, and First Nations Australias. So I'd be interested in both of your views. So Trish, any thoughts on that?
I guess there are different ways of measuring social cohesion. I've done a whole literature review on that question. We have our own definition, which we've kind of articulated, and that's the conceptual basis of the survey. And we're very aware of different ways of defining it, and in fact, negative ways of using the term to mean kind of assimilation or something like that. Everyone has to be the same in order to be cohesive. We strongly advocate against that way of looking at social cohesion. In terms of in strengthening social cohesion, it's a multifaceted concept, and it needs a multifaceted approach. There are many things that can contribute to it or take away from it. And so it's just not one thing, it's more complex than that.
Yeah. There is a question here, actually, that Trish, you might like to respond to. which is really whether or not there is it actually relates to some previous work that we've done, which is what's the impact really of media discourse and political rhetoric around social cohesion.
Yeah, it can be, it certainly can shape narratives. I mean, the role of the media is to put narratives out there into the public sphere, whether they be political or social or any other type. And those narratives in turn can affect people's attitudes and behaviours as well. So there's certainly potential for negative narratives to have negative impacts. It's not something we've necessarily studied. We've looked a little bit at the role of social media, and as James kind of alluded to before, it tends to have a mixed impact. It can be quite a positive thing as well as quite a negative thing. So again, it's a complex issue.
Yeah, there are various questions related to local areas, and particularly communities and social and community housing in particular areas like the ACT, for instance, and some questions about the social cohesion compass. It is limited, I agree, and what you do get is the Scanlon index at for a particular local government area, and then you'll see whether or not it is above or below the median, and that's probably the most we can give you. What we will get with this year is actually some degree of a bit of a trend around that space. So hopefully there will be more, and I appreciate that people are going and having a look at it, which is terrific. Can you reflect on trust in government, where there are nuances in local services versus other government services? So James, what about talking about trust in government?
Sure. So we asked about trust in a range of institutions, including government this year. So in respect to the federal government, we had sort of during the 2010s, so around about an average of 29-30% of people said they trusted the federal government to do the right thing all or most of the time by the Australian people. This then increased during the COVID-19 pandemic. So as I touched on at the start of the presentation, reflecting a sort of positive response to how governments were putting in place steps to protect their health and well-being. And that was also replicated in the sort of trust and confidence we had in the state government's handling of the crisis as well. But since the pandemic, that sort of trust in government is declined. So in 2024, about 1 in 3, 34% of people trust either their state government or the federal government all most of the time. And so that was a bit lower than sort of the average of the sort of trust that we measured in other institutions. So people interestingly, people were reasonably trustworthy in things like the police and the health system and the education, where, you know, we're getting around sort of 70% of people trusting those all most of the time. Sort of 40 to 50% trusted things like business and trade unions. About 24, I think, trusted traditional media companies, and then only 8% trusted social media companies, which perhaps helps to explain those findings around sort of attitudes towards people of Muslim and Jewish faith among social media users. So just because they use social media doesn't necessarily mean they either trust the information coming in or the platforms that deliver that information either.
James and Trish, there is a question about why we chose to use the terminology people from non-English speaking background rather than to refer to cold or multicultural communities. So I know we have a particular view, and I know Trish has written an essay on that, which people can find on our website. But James or Trish, do you want to respond to why we utilize that particular term?
Well,
from Trish has some really good views on that, but I'll just say that to make sure that you know, I don't the non-English speaking background was a short sort of choice of my own. So it doesn't necessarily reflect the preferences or ideals of the Scanlon Institute. But just to say that, you know, I sort of agree very strongly with their position, which hopefully Trish will tell us more about sort of not labeling people as best as possible, and you know, sort of just, you know, well, anyway, can you tell us more about it, Trish?
Sure. Yeah, it's a term that we don't like to use. I guess it's limiting. It excludes some groups. It comes with assumptions. that we don't necessarily believe hold true. And most importantly, people we've spoken to who come from backgrounds other than Anglo, white, Australian, or however you want to refer to those backgrounds, they find the term very uncomfortable and prefer it not to be used. So we tend to take that view as well.
Thank you. Thanks very much. We are now nearly out of time. So I really wanted to just say, I want to thank everybody for joining us today, and I hope that you found this extended question session beneficial. Please don't hesitate to contact the Institute if you would like to arrange team or organisation briefings on any of the findings, or to discuss their broader interpretation or application to your specific area or sector. You can contact us at info@scanloninstitute.org.au, or you can contact me directly. I'd also like to encourage you to delve into our social cohesion compass, as many of you have already started, or check out our latest narratives and essays, and register to receive our event and publication notifications. Finally, I did announce at the launch that next year we'll be holding a conference in place of this launch on the 24th of October, 2025. I do hope that many of you will be able to join us to delve more deeply into the extraordinary resource that is the Mapping Social Cohesion Surveys, and what it tells us about how the Australian society is changing and managing its social cohesion. It will be highly interactive and engage the community, researchers, media, local government, and young people to consider where we go from here. Thank you very much to everybody for joining us today, and we hope to see you very soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.